Okay, so your learning intention for this one is just to locate. You should already understand what the literary devices are and what they mean, and your job is to locate the examples I provide and then take the next step and locate one of your own within the text, except for, of course, allusions, which will be covered pretty comprehensively by me. And for you, the success criteria will be you will have located these and you have annotated them in your own copy of the text in your own way that makes sense to you. All right, so the second personification, you're looking Act 5, Scene 5, line 23, and the entire thing is actually an extended metaphor, which is where you take what is a metaphor, which is just comparing two things that may not necessarily be clearly similar, and then you continue or you persist with the metaphor until you've taken it quite to almost an extreme. So an easy example of this is the Outcast song Roses, I believe, where he's comparing roses to a person. So we annotate the whole thing. The full quote is, "Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." So the candle bit doesn't really relate too neatly, but the actual personification is an extended metaphor. So this is an example of personification because it's giving feelings, thoughts, and all other kind of comparisons with life itself. All right, we're looking at allusions now. And we are going to Act 2, Scene 1, line 67, around 55 on this copy. So for me it's right next to 55, which says, "Thus with stealthy pace, with Tarquin's ravishing strides towards his design, moves like a ghost," which is also a simile if we want to add that as well. So we've got moves like a ghost is a nice neat little simile, and Tarquin, and often you'll see that these literary devices come sort of in bunches because it's something most writers would have to consciously think about to try and do, because it's sort of an extra level than just telling a story. It's also adding additional meaning onto it. So Tarquin, I don't exactly know who Tarquin is, but apparently it's an allusion to something that I'm not aware of. So you'll note this down as an allusion. Obviously for your creative response, you're going to be actually making allusions to things you're aware of. So simply the fact that you know this is an allusion will help you to kind of create your own and realize the way that it is done. So here it is with Tarquin's ravishing stride. So it's making a comparison between the character that it presumes we know, which of course, because we're modern people, we do not. If you read in the notes, it says that Tarquin is a Roman prince who raped Lucrece, which is just wonderful information for us. Second one, we're looking for Act 2, Scene 3, line 8. So we are Act 2, Scene 3, line 8. The allusion is equivocator, which apparently is an allusion to something to do with the gunpowder plot, which is a historical event where they attempted to blow up basically the parliament or a castle that was important to the time. So it says here in our notes, an equivocator is a liar, but this seems to be a reference to Henry Garnet, a priest who tried to lie his way out of being involved in the gunpowder plot and was hanged in 1606. So again, a great topical reference that we don't really understand as modern people. We could go and research it if we really wanted, but that doesn't necessarily help us with the task we're doing now. Just so you know that there are this many allusions in the text. Act 3, Scene 1, line 57 is where we're looking. And we're looking for Mark Antony was by Caesar. So even without knowing what's going on, you can see that that's clearly an allusion. Whether it makes sense to us or not is a separate thing. If we scan our notes, it has nothing to report about Mark Antony and Caesar. And if you want to research that, you can, but just know that that's an allusion. And again, it's a comparison between the events or the things that happen to these people and what's happening in the story, which is what you'll want to be doing for your own version. Last one, we're going to go to Act 5. We're going to ignore that piece of paper. Act 5, Scene 8, lines 1 to 2. So Act 5, alright, last one. Act 5, Scene 8, why should I play the Russian fool and die? So this is a reference to, sorry, did I say Russian? Why should I play the Roman fool and die? And basically what this means is that the Romans had basically the principle that you should commit suicide before you should surrender. And so in this scene he's saying, why would I be the person to kill myself? He kind of wants to go out Killing someone, as he says, on mine own sword, while I see lives, the gashes do better upon them. So he's basically saying, why would I kill myself? I can go out fighting, you know, like a man, I guess would be the way he would put it. And that's an allusion to the practice of the Romans at the time. Okay, so verbal irony, we're looking here, probably line 53 for your text, and it was a rough night. So we know, obviously, this is verbal irony because he's just been killed, and he's been killed by Macbeth. So it's quite ironic for him to then turn to someone and say it was a rough night when he knows that someone has just been killed. Alrighty, so in terms of foreshadowing, we're looking at a nice easy one, Act 1, Scene 3, and it is the lines between 45 and 50. All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor. All hail Macbeth, that shall be king thereafter. And so this is a neat example of foreshadowing, because this is telling us basically what will happen to Macbeth, and it tells us what's going to happen next. And then, as I said, this is foreshadowing, so I'm going to note that down, but it's also an example of dramatic irony, because this is something we already know. We already know that the current Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor, this is an example of foreshadowing, but also dramatic irony, because we already know one of these facts, because we know that someone has died, and therefore he's next in line. And so therefore it's dramatic irony. Obviously it's not as funny as your typical examples, or as tense as your typical examples of dramatic irony, but it is an example. Okay, for an example of a simile, we're going to Act 4, Scene 1, line 19, which is like a hell broth boil and bubble. So it's talking about trouble, powerful trouble, and that it will be like a hell broth boil and bubble, which is a neat little simile comparing the trouble that they're going to make with the cauldron that they are using to generate the trouble that they are making, basically. And then, just because it's right nearby, there's another simile stated by Hecate in Act 4, Scene 1, line 43, where she says that, and now about the cauldron sing, like elves and fairies in a ring, which is another neat and clear little simile. And you can see, if you're unsure, you're looking for a shortcut of how to find all these literary devices, a general rule of thumb is you look for where Hecate and the witches are speaking, because they basically get all the best lines in the play. And then, as I sort of cross-explained with my reference to metaphor, as I explained with my example of this being an example of personification, it's also a metaphor, and an extended metaphor at that. And hopefully you can see the difference between a metaphor and extended metaphor in basically it's just the length of it. And for this we are in Act 5, Scene 5, lines 15 to 25. So we'll look for is Soliloquy, which is Act 1, Scene 5. And keep in mind a soliloquy is basically just one person talking. And so for that, it's this entire section of the play where Lady Macbeth is talking to herself. You can see that because it says, enter Lady Macbeth alone with a letter. So unless she's talking to the letter, which in itself is probably quite an odd thing to do, it's definitely a soliloquy in the sense that she's talking both to herself and to the audience. And you can see when she finishes, or as she comes to a close or is interrupted, the attendant walks in. So this is our example of a soliloquy. And so if you're creating your own for your own story, you'll want to be basically adding a section either through an actual letter or through dialogue where your character soliloquizes or makes a soliloquy on what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and what's going on. Alrighty, hope that helps. Enjoy.